Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney will make an official visit to China this week, the very first by a Canadian Prime Minister in 8 years. As Canada seeks deeper engagement with China, better understanding between the two peoples is always crucial. Mark Rowswell, arguably one of the most well-known Canadians for Chinese in history, is popularly known as Dashan among Chinese audiences. Born and raised in Canada, he is one of the most famous foreigners in China, where he has worked as a media personality and cultural ambassador for decades. As a good learner and performer of Xiangsheng, a revered form of China traditional comedy dialogue, Dashan appeared several times on China's Spring Festival Gala. He also performed the Dashan Live, mixing Chinese comedy with Western stand-up. In recent years, he falls in love with ancient Chinese poetry and research about one of the most influential cultural figures of China about 1,000 years ago. And here's my latest conversation with Mark. Dashan, good to see you. Mark, how are you?
Nice to see you again.
Nice to see
I'm
you.
doing well, thank you. Yeah.
Tell us more about, what is it like for you? I mean, after all, this Prime Minister's visit by Canada to China will be the very first time after a long time. For you, what does that mean?
Well, everyone's pleased to see things improving, and the macro environment makes it easier for all of us to do our work. Of course, I work mainly in cultural field, in performing and everything, so I'm not so directly involved with politics and diplomacy, but the overall environment is important for all of us working between Canada and China, I believe. So it's a positive sign. You can feel it in the air, you can feel the energy building, and we're all looking forward to a successful visit.
If you got a chance to meet him,
I haven't yet. No.
and
This
what would
is
you
his
say
first
to
trip
him
to China.
if?
As before his life in politics, I believe Mark Carney had a lot of interaction with China. He used to be our Bank of Canada governor, and then he was the Bank of England governor, and he's a well-established businessman. I'm sure he's done a lot of work with China, but this is his first time to China in his role as Prime Minister.
Yeah, indeed. So, but you, instead of politics, you are busy with culture, researching and running after a man almost celebrating his 1,000 years, Su Shi.
That's our goal. We're working up to his 1,000th year anniversary, which will be in 2037.
Wow. Okay.
So we've got 11 more years to go, but there's a lot of ground to cover. It's really fascinating. This is the poet Su Shi, also known as Su Dongpo. And if people don't know his poetry, they certainly know some of the dishes that he invented or named after him. Dongpo Rou, one of the most famous Chinese dishes all around the world, I think.
He is such a well-known and, shall I say, a complete, comprehensive cultural figure. I mean, look at his works. You know better than I do. You've been researching about him for years. Poetry, lyrics, prose, paintings, calligraphy, and the list goes on. Plus, he's a political leader. He was the middle-level political leader. He was on exile.
Yes, and of course, even engineering projects like the West Lake in Hangzhou, the famous causeway named after him, Su Di. He did a lot of work as a government official as well. I guess in Western terms, you'd call him a Renaissance man, although it was not the Renaissance period in China. But in that sense, he was an established scholar and a poet and an official, and led really a fascinating life. I think the thing that's most interesting about him, I'm trying to figure out how we would explain to a Western audience, because I know a few years ago, there was a documentary the BBC did called China's Greatest Poet, where they were talking about Du Fu. When we talk about China's greatest poet, normally we'd think Li Bai or Du Fu, one of those two. I kind of think of Su Shi as being China's favorite poet. Someone said he's actually China's favorite person. If you had to pick someone from ancient China who everybody loves, that would probably be Su Dongpo. So I think that's a really interesting question. Why do people love him so much? Why is he China's famous, most favorite, not only poet, but ancient person? I think it's a fascinating topic.
Well, you see that revival, isn't it, of interest in him among the Chinese general public. Dance dramas, drama on the stage, novels, recitals, music, everything about him. Why there's a revival of interest
When we started this just a year ago, we went to his hometown of Meishan in Sichuan province, and we went to his birthplace, which is it was a museum open to the public now. And their first reaction was, "You're going to do another documentary on Su Dongpo?"
That shows.
But I hope we did one that was rather unique and bring a different flavor to it. There's just so much ground to cover. I think also because I think the main thing is that he led a life of real extreme ups and downs. And so a lot of what he left for us in terms of cultural or even sort of emotional or spiritual achievement is sort of to show people that when life is down, when things aren't going so well, you can still be productive, you can still make a difference, you can still lead a full and fulfilling life. And that's really what he did. He had good times and bad times, and through it all, he just led an incredibly productive life and was an inspiration to people of his age and 1,000 years later.
He is not well known for being a doctrinaire, but rather embracing so many different kinds of philosophies, be it Buddhism or Taoism or Confucianism. Your understanding of how this man has managed to cultivate himself and be able to fit into different circumstances with ease, one could argue.
Well, I think perhaps in China, Chinese philosophy, there's more pragmatism, or, we think of, in a Western sense, you can't really be Christian and Muslim at the same time, right? Those are sort of competing philosophies or competing religions. But in traditional Chinese culture, I think Confucianism is more sort of a social system. It's the glue that binds the society together. But many people also received inspiration from Taoism and from Buddhism in different ways. I think
the way they look at their life, right? The way they look at nature.
I just think traditional Chinese culture or traditional Chinese philosophy is much more inclusive that way, is that you don't have to pick one philosophy. You can sort of create a blend of them. And that's Su Shi probably is the preeminent example of that.
And it's not black and white either.
Yeah, and just a fascinating person. I mean, he like many traditional Chinese scholars, he aspired to be a government official. I think that's something that's different from the West. We don't think of poets as being government officials, but in China, of course, most poets were government officials, or they aspired to be, and often they felt that their talents were not being used. He did what he thought was best for the emperor and for China, but the emperor banished him, and then brought him back and then banished him again. So he was up and down. And I think that's really what gives his life sort of a special essence to it, is how he managed all that up and down through his life.
We have raised the appetite of our audience for a very long time over our conversation. I'm sure they want to know what exactly is the taste of this poet called Su Shi.
One of the most famous lines from his poetry, of course, is "莫听穿林打叶声，何妨吟啸且徐行." And that's sort of a reference to, when things are not going well in life, when it's raining, don't focus on the rain, just whistle a tune and keep going.
莫听穿林打叶声，何妨吟啸且徐行。竹杖芒鞋轻上马，谁怕？一蓑烟雨任平生。料峭春风吹酒醒，微冷。山头斜照却相迎，回首向来萧瑟处，归去也无风雨，也无晴。
Tell me, when you are trying to look for him or the soul of this poet, what have you learned along the process? And why is it so relevant to you now, at this age, during this time?
Well, it's all been an interesting experience. You know, about a year and a half ago, I've been doing sort of short videos for the internet on various classical Chinese poems, and all of the poems are something that just personally I enjoyed, or it spoke to me somehow, and so I wanted to express that feeling. And I did one on him from the Chi Fu, Ode on the Red Cliffs. And I was in my canoe and I was paddling on a lake in Canada, and because the poem talks about him being in a small boat and it's very philosophical, and so I was paddling the canoe and practicing my lines.
驾一叶之扁舟，举匏樽以相逐。寄蜉蝣于天地，渺沧海之一粟。哀吾生之须臾，羡长江之无穷。
And that video went viral in China, so that's what actually brought me the opportunity to do a documentary, and I just really enjoyed this year learning more about it, rather than learning about, you know, the vast sea of Chinese poetry in general, to focus on one specific poet and really learn that well. I think sometimes it's really, you know, by picking on one angle and really digging deep, you actually gain a wider understanding than just specifically what you're researching. So I think that's been great, and I seriously am. We're going to do this on an ongoing basis, and the goal is to celebrate his 1000th anniversary in 2037. So I think you'll be hearing a lot more of this from Dashan over the coming years.
It was at a time when China was actually in a transition. It was both the most celebrated time and the difficult time for the dynasty in which he was in.
Well, the core of Chinese society and Chinese culture is extremely stable, of course. That's why it's an ancient society, the oldest continuous civilization in the world now. There has to be some kind of stability to the core, because obviously there have been huge ups and downs and huge disruptions through Chinese history, but Chinese culture has survived through all of it. So there's something incredibly stable about Chinese culture. And we've seen, again, in the last 40 or 50 years, perhaps even an unprecedented level of change in Chinese society. But, you know, that core of Chinese culture is stable. And I think that's one of the fascinating things for me as a non-Chinese person. You know, if we come from the English world, trying to read something in English 500, 600 years ago, Shakespeare is really only 400 and some years ago. It's almost unintelligible now. It's, you know, it's very difficult to understand Shakespeare. But in the Chinese language, you can read things that were written 1,000, 2,000 or more years ago, and you know, with a basic education, they're still understandable. And I think that's one of the great things about China, is that we can look back 1,000 years and find something that's like immediately relevant to China today. You know, like I was saying, a lot of young people in China still get inspiration from his poetry because he was such an inspiring figure. And there's at least, you know, 5 or 6 poems that are sort of widely known by everybody, and yeah, and easily approachable. And of course, everyone knows the food that he invented as well. So his legacy really lives on. I think throughout the tremendous changes in China, there's core elements like that, like the poetry of Su Po, that are sort of timeless.
So some of the things that you've been trying to describe seem to me, it's hard to express it so directly in plain language, but rather one needs to feel it. For example, through the poems of Su Po. Is that what you're trying to say?
I think one of the things I really enjoyed about this documentary we did is that we were able to tell a lot of, not just his story, but actually just narrate his poetry, because a lot of his poetry tells the story in his own words, of course, in a very poetic way.
You've been doing recitals of ancient Chinese poetry with many of your Chinese friends and probably international friends as well. You see this huge, warm response coming from your audience here in China, I have to say. You got a full house packed, many cities. It's amazing. So what does this say about the China today and the Chinese that you have got to know? How much they are looking for the strength in their own culture? How much are they digesting the changing life they are facing every day vis-a-vis the huge long history that they have.
Well, I think maybe that's a strength of China, right? I mean, over the 30 some, almost 40 years that I've been here, of course, it's been a time of reform and opening, and China has learned a lot from the outside world. There's been, people have been learning English and learning modern technology and all of that. But once the standard of living in China has increased, as it has so tremendously over the past few decades, people start to look back to their traditional culture. And that's sort of the stable core of Chinese culture that, when in times of strife, maybe you don't have a lot of time to focus on traditional culture. But now that the standard of living is much higher in China, we see people moving back more towards traditional culture and really taking the best of that, and combining it with the best of modern culture. I think culture continues to evolve and everything, but there's such a tremendous wealth of traditional culture in China that you can spend a lifetime researching and delving into that.
When we talk about culture, naturally I would think about another word, civilization. Recently, Mark, I'm sure you have noticed the debate about the so-called Eastern civilization, Western civilization, Chinese civilization, and the ups and downs. There seems to be apparent competition, according to some, among these civilizations. Your take on this?
Well, there will always be competition between peoples and between countries, and a lot of that is healthy. That's how we develop as humanity, through that cooperation and competition as well. And the East is up and the West is down. I don't really buy into that as a simple philosophy, because I think after all, we're all in this together. And when I'm researching Su Po and traditional Chinese culture, this is also world heritage as well. It belongs to the world, and I think the world needs to know a little bit more about the best of Chinese culture.
You came to China when you were in university. You studied Chinese language. You participated in Chinese Spring Festival Gala, which is the biggest viewing events in China, and become a household name in this country. Everybody knows you in the street, and you become a name for any foreigners who are in China, in a way.
在那1953年美帝的和谈阴谋被揭穿，这也不好。
And later, you began your cultural business, trying to put on performances for both sides, Canada, US, China. And later, you're also involved in some of the cultural productions. For example, the Xiangsheng Redemption, the drama you put on the stage in Chinese. Amazing, isn't it? I was there. I was really taken by it. And also now a series of recital events about Chinese ancient poem and the research about Su Shi. Overall, these decades, how do you read the evolution of China sees the world, if I could put it as such a big topic, and how the outside world sees China as well?
Well, there's always a lot more work to do on that front. I think I think the explosion of information and the internet and the information age that we live in now, information doesn't necessarily equal understanding. And so we need to work more on understanding and on filtering the information. I think that's really a challenge for modern people, is how do we deal with all of the information that we get? And to be frank, a lot of the information that we get on the internet or through modern media is misleading. And how do we filter that out and build understanding rather than simply knowledge? I think that's a core issue. But I just always feel there's so much to do. I have to keep healthy so I can keep doing this for many more decades to come, because I'm just having so much fun and enjoying what I'm doing.